Welcome to the second session of the day on historical consciousness abroad, and particularly from two countries, Finland and Australia. You heard a relatively brief summary of the findings from the survey the Canadians and Their Past project conducted during the last 3-4 years from David Northrop and Gerald Friesen. The findings barely scratch the surface, and we will continue to explore them as we go, particularly comparing them with findings from other countries, and that's what this session will focus on. It's worth reiterating that the survey that we used in our project was modeled after two previous surveys. First conducted by the Americans starting in 1995 or around that time, and then the Australians. It's also worth reminding, perhaps you haven't heard enough, that these surveys are similar to each other. They're not replicates of each other. They vary in a lot of ways. In the way that we have conducted the survey, the questions on the survey, the samples, the sample sizes, and the foci. There are very different sections in the three surveys. So it's good to keep that in mind. The two speakers in this session will share findings from their similar surveys in their respective countries. First Finland, then Australia. These two speakers play a very special, very different roles in the Canadians and Their Past project. We met Paul Ashton and Paula Hamilton several years ago, in 2004, 7 years ago, as we were conceptualizing the questionnaire and the survey study. And we benefited from their experiences and guidance in deciding on key issues with respect to how we would conduct the study, the types of questions, formats of questions, and so on and so forth. We connected with Pilvi Trosti midway into the survey study 3-4 years ago in Quebec City. She was at that time interested in conducting a similar study in her own country. Today they're going to share their findings from their research. And I'll tell you a little bit about each of them before I turn the podium over to them. Pilvi Trosti is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Helsinki. And her research focuses on presence of the past in contemporary societies. Paul Ashton is Professor of Public History at the University of Technology, Sydney. He is co-director of the Australian Centre for Public History and founding co-editor of Journal Public History Review. Paul and Paula were the two key collaborators on the Australian project. I'll turn it over to Pilvi now.
Thank you very much. I will start echoing what Paula Hamilton said yesterday. Thank you very much for all the cooperation and generosity for our Canadian colleagues. As was said just a few minutes ago, it was exactly 3 years ago that I came here and benefited hugely from the experience of the Canadians and also Australians and Americans, as David Thielen was also here at the time, one of the masters of the American study. And you will probably, those of you who've been involved in the surveys in other countries, you will see what I have taken from you and what I have not taken from you, and probably also realize that I tried to listen some of the advice you gave that, during those days here in Quebec. I will first present a little bit the survey we have done, conducted in Finland in the last years, because it has structural and also in terms of content some differences to the other countries, and then go through some of the results which I thought were probably interesting to you and also illustrate some of the characteristics of a small country, as I was asked to talk from the perspective of a small nation state. And finally come to some conclusions, again, ordered conclusions by the title that Jocelyn gave to me, because, of course, as a Finn, I don't think about coming from a small nation state, but when I come to Canada, I have to think in those terms. Well, what I think first is worth saying a few words is the research tradition that I found important when we did the survey in Finland. There were two traditions, in fact, that influenced quite greatly the entire survey. The first one was the research called Youth and History, which was done in most European countries in mid-90s. I was myself in charge of that particular survey in Bosnia and Herzegovina, in one of the countries of former Yugoslavia in late 90s. And that was a youth survey, but very much motivated by the end of the Cold War, so therefore, of course, very much politically orientated in terms of its questions. So while it did ask about the engagement with the past, it also asked about views concerning certain historical events that were considered to be probably debatable events where the interpretations differ from country to country in Europe. So that was the one starting point. And the other one were these Anglo-American surveys that we have discussed here already many times, the US, Australia, and Canada. And what we thought in the Finnish context was relevant to try to bring together, in a way, the thinking of both. So to have the slightly, probably more political approach that was characteristic to youth and history, and that meant, for instance, asking questions also relevant to the sort of recent political history, events, etc., but also to include several questions very similar or even exactly the same ones that had been used in the Anglo-American surveys in order to be able to compare the ways of engagement with the past that has already been discussed here today. So in terms of the research process, in 2008 we started the development and did some testing of the survey questions because, of course, as elsewhere, this was the first time this kind of major survey was done in Finland, so you needed to do a lot of testing before doing the actual major survey. Then in 2009 we did a pilot, and one should probably mention here that in the pilot phase we decided not to include the immigrant population of Finland to the survey. I'm not going to go into details, but first of all, the immigrant population is quite different if you compare to Australia, Canada, or US and Finland. We have about 130,000 immigrants out of the 5 million people, and we decided to do a qualitative study at the same time concerning the historical consciousness of those immigrant groups, and they were not included in the sample of this study that I will now be talking about. And finally, the main survey data was finalized in January 2010. When I say finalized, I mean that was the time when it was all collected and sort of the quality of the data was checked and so on. And finally, we had 1,208 respondents aged 15 to 79 in that data. And that was a postal survey, so that was first difference in terms of methodologically to the Anglo-American examples, mainly because we hardly do telephone service except for marketing purposes, and we used to be this Nokia land, and unfortunately Apple has now taken over, so it's no longer the story of Finland. But that has also meant that there have been so many telephone surveys that you can't really do a serious societal survey anymore by telephone. So you can do the postal or internet, and in our case the postal seemed the most appropriate taking the length of the survey. What I learned here in Canada 3 years ago was that it would be very good also to get some qualitative data to sort of help to analyze the answers you get through a postal survey. So we did follow-up interviews in 2010, altogether 49 interviews, and those interviewed had all also taken part in the survey. So they were chosen randomly among those who agreed to be part of the interview group as well. So we had 49 interviews from various age groups, gendered from both genders from across the Finland, etc. Well, this is then the structure of our both survey and then also the interviews. It was divided into 5 themes. The first one, meaning of history, and that was the part that included mainly similar questions that were used also in Australia, Canada, and the US. So what is the meaning of history to you? How much do you trust the various sources? How much have you been engaged with the various ways of the past? How is past present in your life, etc. The second theme was development and factors of change. This came more from the Youth and History survey, where you had several questions trying to ask how do people see actually the time and development, whether it's whether it's a curve upward or downward, or whether it's circular, and what are the factors of change that influence development up to now, and what people think are the influencing life in the will be influencing life in the future. Then we asked about the meaning of the past for one's own generation, with several questions. What have been key experiences in your life for your generation? What do you think have been the most important developments in Finnish society during this period, etc.? And then the fourth group was very important when it comes to the sort of national discussion around this research, namely the historical events that we chose. 1918, which was a civil war year in Finland, the Second World War period, and then the post-Second World War development, modernization of the country. And finally, the fifth theme was today's Finland and the world, echoing, of course, the whole idea of historical consciousness being about the past and the present and the future, and how these 3 time levels are connected. And there we chose central concepts of contemporary society, such as immigration, competitiveness, globalization, and welfare society to be on focus. So then to some selected results. First about historical activity and trust, and here we see some comparisons already that were referred in the introduction. This question that was already part of David's presentation, have you during the last year, in other words, how much engagement has there been with the past in the last 12 months? So I have taken all the countries. Finland is blue, US red, Australia green, and Canada purple. I'm not going to go through all the various items, but I would just put your attention to the blue, as I'm talking about the Finnish results, blue column, which you can see is the highest in almost all ways of engagement with the past, starting from the films and TV programs here, and coming down, for instance, visiting historical sites and museums. Here is, by the way, this internet. So we were 2009, and you can see that was then something like 60%, so it is growing as was expected. I think the Canadian result would be similar here. And here, of course, one has to remember that we have data from various decades, and so they are not entirely comparable, but I do think they give an idea at least. What I say from this picture in Finland is that this proves to me what we thought was the case, that Finns are incredibly engaged with the past. It's a sort of small nations probably due to be a very history-intense country, and all the interviews we did in a way supported this sort of idea. And all those who have read Thielens and Rosenzweig book will recall that their focus really is that how much engagement there was with the past, and so I always say if you look at the US and the Finnish results, so at least comparably, we have even more, so if that was the stress there, we should stress that too. Another comparison is then concerning the trust for the various sources. How much do you trust the following sources of historical information? And here, the interesting findings in the Finnish data concern the sort of relationship between the fact and fictional sources, and then what has been mentioned here before, the importance of the family stories as compared to, for instance, school teaching and university teaching. So here you would have the stories of parents and relatives. So and here you would have just next to it sorry, where do I have to point? Here. Can you see the pointer? Can you see it? For a minute it shows, yeah. Okay, well the point is that the school stories and university teaching is as reliable as family stories. And I think this is very much comparable to what was found in other countries. Similarly, museums and factual books on history are very highly relied in Finland, much higher than in other countries, while fictional documentaries, plays and so on, unreliable. But the most unreliable, the blue there, down there, that was the one special thing we asked in history, statements of politicians concerning history. So more unreliable than fictional plays, novels, etc. And I should say why we actually asked about this politician thing was that there is a very common habit in the Finnish public to use in particular the Winter War, which was fought in Finland during the Second World War, as a sort of metaphor. We have a winter war in economy sometimes, and we have it here and there. Every year it appears in some sort of context. So it's actually used a lot in our public. Well, then coming to some the more national results from those comparisons. And here I have taken two. So two particular questions, one concerning the Civil War in the spring 1918 and the other one concerning the Second World War period. And so I hope I will now satisfy the gentleman who asked about the wars in the last session, so we will now turn into the war business, because I'm afraid that our grand national story, if you judge it from the school books, from the novels, from the films, it is about wars. This Civil War in spring 1918 resulted from the Declaration of Independence of Finland in 1917, and we still debate what the war in 1918 was about, whether it was a rebellion of the Reds, whether it was a sort of Soviet-supported rebellion, whether it was actually the sort of white right-wing Finnish way to make sure they get the labor movement to be very silent for the next 20 to 30 decades, as happened. Factually, we know it was a civil war, sometimes compared in European terms to the Spanish Civil War. And certainly you had several aspects involved: the social inequality, the independence, the general mess in Europe, the First World War at the back, etc. What we asked was simply, what is your opinion of several statements concerning the war fought in Finland during the spring 1918? And I'm not suggesting that you start reading all the statements. I'll tell in a minute what is relevant for the bigger picture. Why we framed the question this way was that there are several names for the war in the country still being used. And one of the very common debates is that what is actually the right name. So we didn't want to give a name for the war, but we simply said the war fought in spring 1918 at first. And as I said, I'm not going to go to the columns. If someone really wants to study this in detail, you can get the slides from me. But what the story that really came through was about was that people suggested that they did understood all the sides and their motives and so on during the war. The guilt for the war was also relativized, so that in a way all the sides were equally guilty. And finally, there is an interesting little detail for those interested in historical culture and the role of art and literature in shaping the thinking of people. Namely, we asked in one question about one particular novel and its importance for giving information about the events of the war. And that's here. It's this column. So it says, novel series Under the Northern Star is an important source for the information about the 1918 events. And it was across the age group. So it's a very important novel released in 1960s, and which changed also the whole political treatment of the war period. This one I will just show very quickly, because as said in the first question, we didn't say anything about the name. In the next question, we asked about which name have you actually got used to use for the 1918 war, and that was an open question, so we got about 10 different names at least. but the three of them were dominant: the War of Citizens, the Civil War, and the War of Freedom. The War of Citizens being a slightly more leftist notion, Civil War the most neutral, and the War of Freedom the sort of right-wing, more right-wing notion. And what is simply worth noting here is that the younger generations, younger you are, more likely you are to call it civil war. So the war is becoming more and more neutral in its naming. But once you get to the older generations, all three were quite equal. This is a very debatable result in the Finnish context, but as it's not exciting for you, we move on. What did people then say in this interview? Because as I said in the beginning, we interviewed 49 of those who were in the survey sample. And you could pick up probably a sort of three characteristics from the interviews. First, you still have a lot of personal stories from 1918. So the great-grandfather was there and the great-grandfather was here. But very often that they could have been in different sides, and that wasn't so problematic anymore. It was simply the story that was important or interesting, exciting. The critical interpretation was dominant, critical meaning that the understanding of the various motivations behind the war, the difficulty still to really say who was guilty and so on. And then finally, slightly surprisingly, the meaning for today was stressed in particular by younger generations. They would often say, but I still think it plays a role in the way people think about politics. I think it does actually have a say when we think about how we move on to the this and that. And that might partly be because we had anniversary in 2008, so we had lots of TV programs and so on. But when we looked at the survey data, where we had asked also about the political opinions, it actually showed that this particular question in this particular question, the political thinking played the greatest role in terms of the sort of historical views. It wasn't true for the Second World War or any other events, but for this particular question, say you vote for the Social Democrats now, you are more likely to think that way about the events in 1918. So it seems to be a sort of unconscious, perhaps, behavior or structure of thinking that people still have, even if they are not actively aware of it. Then, moving to another war, the Second World War period, Finland in the Second World War was, in the beginning of the war, 1939, attacked by the Soviet Union, and there was the so-called Winter War, which in our sort of national grand narrative is a big thing, because we, of course, think that Finland fought heroically and therefore had a different fate than countries such as Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, etc. But then we also had, after the Winter War, the so-called continuation war that went on almost the entire Second World War period, which many would say was also heroic, but you would also have more people to say, well, there are also other aspects to that war, for instance, the cooperation with Germany, prison camps, etc. And finally, there was also a small war in Lapland. So in a way, we talk about three different wars during the Second World War period in Finland, affecting really the entire country and the whole population. Well, the big story, again, I'm not going to go to all the details, but the survey data gave us, we felt when we looked at the results, actually quite clear picture of what is the major thinking among the population. The Second World War period in Finland, it's about victory, it's about patriotism, but it is also about traumas and about feeling somewhat guilty to what happened in particular in the early 1940s in terms of treatment of Jews or not actually at least trying to do anything against deportations from Finland. And again here, the historical culture and literature plays a great role. So again, we had the novel for this war too, a novel called Unknown Soldier, and very high ranking for the importance of that novel as a source of information for the Second World War period in Finland. Interestingly, written by the same author than the novel I mentioned about 1918. So here is an author that really has influenced the Finnish thinking about their history. Concerning the so-called difficult questions about the past and about the Second World War period, being allied with the Germany, or whether the continuation war was only a victory, or whether it also had some problematic sides and aspects, I assumed as a scholar that we would actually get more black and white picture than we did. People seem to be very aware of the problematic nature of the Finnish participation in the 1940s, much more so than our sort of public debate would suggest. Giving you an example, that our president a couple of years ago had great difficulties in Paris when she was asked about whether the Finnish war in 1940s was connected to the war, Second World War in general, or whether it was a separate war, and she sort of tried to say it was a totally separate war and we only fought against the Soviet Union, we have nothing to do with any other developments, while it seems the large public is actually already quite fine with the fact that, well, it was part of the broader development, and certainly no one gets out totally clean in such situations. Interviews concerning the Second World War period, what was, again, I picked sort of three themes. First was then that the positive and negative stories went parallel. In the same interviews, you might get first the sort of stressing of the patriotism, the participation of women, which was unusual, etc., but also then how wars in general are horrible and you should never talk about wars in heroic terms and so on. The theme that appeared in almost every single interview was the silence in the family. I wish they had spoken more. Oh yes, my father, he never said anything, he wanted the life to go on, and I now regret I didn't force him to talk. He only spoke when some of his mates came and they drank together. Consumption of alcohol was always part of these stories, also when I asked, so when did they talk? And that was mentioned that in these sort of male groups. And finally, the madness of war was also stressed in almost every single interview, no matter younger or older women or men, that in a sense also that it should never repeat. We have seen in this small country how horrible wars are and so on. And to me, I mean, these are all, it seems almost banal to state these sort of results, but when I listen every Independence Day, which we have every December, the speeches, they are full of these sort of patriotic phrases. As a scholar, when I just gave an interview concerning these results, I got quite a lot of hate mail, how unpatriotic I am and how I don't respect the war veterans, etc. So these, somehow the public, again, picture of the war and what is important to be discussed as compared to what seems to be the sort of private thinking among the Finnish population differ greatly. Finally, some conclusive thoughts. Story of a small nation. As said in the beginning, this was a title that also forced me to think our results from a slightly different perspective than I do when I work from the in the Finnish context. The first obvious remark or conclusion is, of course, that we do talk about a history nation here. As I said, it didn't surprise, I think, any of us. If you look at statistics, for instance, books sold, we sell a huge amounts of general history books, books about wars and so on. So new titles appear every year before Christmas, so you know what to buy for your parents and so on. The second, the Finland and the rest of the world. I didn't show you the data here, but one interesting finding was that when we asked about the general development in Europe, in Finland, and in the world at large, how has it been until today, and what are people expecting about the future? In all results, it was very consistent that talking about Finland was as though it wasn't not part of Europe, neither of the world, so it was much more positive, the attitude towards the Finnish past, as well as the expectations towards the Finnish future as compared to the future of Europe or the future of the world at large. So as though there is some sort of small nation-state laboratory called Finland, whose fate doesn't actually depend on the fate of the rest of the universe. Fourthly, concerning the wars, as I already showed some of the results on a very preliminary way, I would say that the patriotism goes together with critical views. And that's probably something that can happen in a small nation state rather than if you talk in a larger context. So in a way, they don't go against necessarily. And finally, this question about private history and public history, or rather probably private interpretations of history and public interpretations of history. That's probably a characteristic of a small nation that, in particular, when we talk about wars, the public and private actually go hand in hand. They support one another. The public story at large comes through in private stories, but then the private stories just make it much broader and understand the complicated nature of things better than the public interpretation. So here are some preliminary thoughts. As said, I'm currently actually working on the manuscript of the book. I had it here with me because it's very difficult to remember all those data, as everyone knows who's been working with the data. So if you ask complicated questions, I'm afraid I will have to refer to my own text. But I also hope to be much wiser about this issue about bigger multi-nation countries vis-à-vis a small nation state after this conference. So thank you once more for the invitation, and thank you for listening.